decided we wanted to add sourdough into our family's routine, it was really intimidating at first. Do I need to keep it on my counter and feed it all the time? Am I gonna have a ton of discard that I need to figure out what to do with? Well, over time, we developed a really simple system for doing sourdough that works really, really well for our family that we're gonna share with you. So about 10 years ago, we were kind of at the beginning of our real food journey. We were trying to heal some things in our body, and at the time we were actually on a grain-free diet and weren't really eating any grains at all, more of kind of a paleo style way of eating. Fruits, vegetables, meat were kind of the main things that we were eating. But at the time, I was also super interested in learning more kind of about the homesteading movement and just natural living and all of the things associated with that. And so I had picked up the book, The Art of Fermentation by Sandor Katz, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, from the library, and I was reading it and I was just so inspired to ferment everything, but specifically to start my own sourdough starter. And so, like I said, we hadn't been eating any grains, but it seemed like, okay, if we're gonna start slowly incorporating some grains, sourdough is definitely where we wanna start because it's the most nutritious, it's the most digestible, and just kind of the best bang for your buck if you're gonna incorporate grains into your diet. And so I happened to just have actually gotten a bag of freshly milled rye flour from some local farmer friends of ours that I had no idea what I was going to do with. And as I was reading his book, The Art of Fermentation, he actually recommends making your own homemade sourdough starter using rye flour. And the reason for that is that rye flour tends to attract more of the wild yeasts than any other type of flour. And so this leads to just an easier starter to make. It tends to be more active and it tends to ferment more quickly. And so I was like, okay, great, I have this flour that I have no idea what I'm gonna do with, so let's go for it. Let's make our own sourdough starter. And I did, I went for it. It worked great. Within 5 days, we had a super bubbly, active starter. And then we were kind of off to the races and needed to figure out what we were gonna do with our sourdough starter. Having come from a more paleo, no grains type of way of eating, I wasn't super gung-ho about wanting to incorporate like tons of sourdough into our diet with every day, you know, for every meal or anything like that. I kind of liked the approach of, okay, how can we incorporate this a few times a week into our diet for kind of more of a fun special treat than making sourdough really be a main everyday sort of part of our diet. And so really that's how we ended up coming up with this once a month sourdough routine that now we have been doing for almost 10 years ever since. So once a month we pull our sourdough starter out of the fridge. So I usually save between a 1/4 cup of starter and a 1/2 cup of starter, somewhere in that range, I'll put in the fridge. And so once a month I pull it out of the fridge and I go ahead and I'm gonna feed that starter 3 times. So we actually have been using, ever since we made our own homemade starter about 10 years ago, we have been going strong on using a 100% rye-fed starter ever since. And we have found that we have a really bubbly, active, strong starter by doing that. And so I would highly recommend incorporating rye flour, especially if you've had a hard time maintaining or starting your own starter and that's something that you're interested in doing. We even had the experience one time of moving to a different state and having to do a big home renovation remodel and having our sourdough starter live in the fridge for about 8 months untouched. And I thought surely the starter is going to be a goner, but I scraped off the top and lo and behold, after a couple feedings, it was back and strong and active, and it has kept going ever since. And so I am pretty sold on using rye flour to feed your starter. And so after I take it out of the fridge, I go ahead and I feed it 3 times before we make anything. Okay, you guys, so when it comes to feeding our starter, I do not measure anything ever. People talk about saturation and have all these fancy terms when it comes to sourdough. I am not fancy about sourdough. We would not consider ourselves sourdough experts by any stretch of the imagination. We do it really simple. I add a little bit of flour, I add a little bit of water, I stir it together until it's about the right consistency that I want it, and I call it good. And that has worked really, really well for us. We have a Nutri-Mill Harvest, which is actually a new purchase for us. Prior to this, we had always used a hand grinder to grind all of our grains, but we recently invested in the Nutri-Mill Harvest, which we've really, really loved. We really love using freshly milled flours for just all of the added nutritional benefits of the fresh flours. And so I usually mill around 8 to 10 cups of rye flour that I'm going to use to feed our starter over the next 3 feedings. And one thing that I should note is that while we use rye flour to feed our sourdough starter, we don't continue to use rye flour when we are actually making, our pizza crust or our bread dough or any of the other sourdough things. So after we have our active starter, then when we're adding flour, we usually add, lately we've been doing a mix, kind of a hodgepodge of a 50% hard spring wheat. It's called a Glen. And then 50% einkorn has kind of been the ratio that we have been doing, but you can use whatever flour you want. If you want, white bread, you can use a white flour. If you want to do an all-purpose flour, or you can do, a whole grain wheat flour like we like to do. So feel free to play around with it and use whatever you like. We always are trying to get the most bang for our buck in terms of nutrition and nutrients out of our food, and we just actually have really come to like kind of that dense, nutty flavor from using those whole grain wheat flours. So every month our sourdough routine looks a little bit different, but what I love about it is we'll make this big bowl of sourdough starter. I'll pull out that 1/4 to 1/2 cup that I need for our next batch of sourdough that's gonna go in the fridge, and then I just go ahead and use up that big bowl of active sourdough starter for all the different things that we're gonna make. After our starter has been fed 3 times and it's nice and bubbly and active, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I always do once we have our big bowl of active sourdough starter is measure out all of the starter that I need for each of the recipes that we're gonna be making. I then separate the 1/4 to 1/2 cup of starter that we're gonna set aside and reserve for our next batch of sourdough, our next once a month sourdough day. And so I put that into a little jar, and I'm gonna go ahead and put that reserved sourdough starter for our next batch into the fridge, and then any sourdough starter that we have left over after that usually goes to making pancakes. Pancakes are just a really great way to use up any active or discard, but we don't have discard. We just do whatever active sourdough starter is left, we'll make pancakes. So sometimes our once a month routines are way simple. If we're really busy, don't have a ton of time, Jim will just make the pizza crust, and we might just make a ton of pancakes with all the leftover active starter. Or other months, like this month, we are actually making several different things, and we're only gonna be making a small amount of pancakes to have on hand. Another reason I love our once a month sourdough routine is that it's something that Jim and I do together. And so we almost view our sourdough nights as like a date night for us. We'll often do it on Saturday night. We'll feed our starter on Friday night, and then Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon, and then we'll put the kids to bed on Saturday evening, and we'll spend the next couple hours just going to town making all these sourdough things. And so Jim's 2 things that he always makes, his staples, are making sourdough bread and our sourdough deep dish pizza crusts. And so that's what he is going to be making this month. And for me, I'm going to be making, I usually do everything else that's not bread and pizza crust, and so I'm going to be making English muffins, and then we are going to try a new recipe that I've actually never tried before for a sourdough chocolate chip cookie bars, or like blondie bars, and then we're going to be doing sourdough pancakes, which is usually what we always do with any just leftover starter that we have. So Jim's gonna go ahead and get started making the dough for our 2 loaves of sourdough bread. And this is about the easiest, most basic sourdough recipe out there. The only ingredients are a little bit of your active sourdough starter and then flour, water, and salt. You put those together, you make a dough, you knead it a few times, and I can link the exact recipe below, but then you just let it sit in a bowl overnight covered and let it rise and do its thing. While he's making the bread dough, and I've already portioned out kind of all of those different amounts of starter that I needed, I'm gonna go ahead and just whip up those pancakes. We actually are having a bit of a bowl shortage, and so I need to use this bowl that has the little bit of active sourdough starter, make the pancakes so that I can free up that bowl to make other things. And so we're gonna make those pancakes first. Making sourdough pancakes is so easy. All you're gonna do is take your active starter. You don't need to add any extra flour or anything else. All you're gonna do is add a couple eggs, add a little bit of baking soda, and add some salt. And then you just go ahead and spoon that into a griddle or onto a hot cast iron pan and make your pancakes. And kind of just like any other homesteading advice that we would give, I feel like just starting simple with sourdough, so start mastering one recipe, whether that's bread or pizza crust or whatever. Start learning how to make one thing, and then once you get that down, adding the next thing, and then adding the next thing, and before you know it, you'll have a whole sourdough arsenal that you'll know how to make, but you just started with one thing, and then it just spiraled from there. So the big thing that makes this once a month sourdough routine awesome and just really work so well for our family is that everything we make on this one day, we then freeze for the whole month ahead. And so as I'm kind of talking through these different things that we're making, I'll share how we go about freezing them. But for pancakes, for example, if you just lay them on a baking sheet in a single layer, I freeze them. After they're frozen, I'm gonna go ahead and stick them into a gallon-sized plastic bag in the freezer, and then we just pull out as we wanna eat them. After I finish making the pancakes, I'm gonna start making these sourdough chocolate chip cookie bars. So when I was growing up, my absolute favorite dessert recipe that I would always request for my birthday or any special occasion or anything like that were the Nestle Toll House cookie bars using the recipe that was on the back of the chocolate chip package. But instead of turning them into cookies, we would always turn them into bar form. I guess people call them blondies or whatever. Chocolate chip cookie bars was always what we called them. And so I have been on the hunt to try to find and perfect the best sourdough chocolate chip cookie bar. And so we are experimenting with a new recipe here today. So maybe if we really love it, you will see us put it on our blog here coming up. But I'm gonna go ahead and get started making these sourdough chocolate chip cookie bars. And another thing that's awesome about turning your cookies into bar form is, again, it's just way easier. You don't have to worry about portioning them into little cookies or having your cookies turn into pancakes, which I've had happen way too many times. And so you can just take that batter, pour it into a 9x13 pan, bake it, cut it into, small squares, and we're actually gonna go ahead, we'll eat a few of these. These will be like, usually when we have our once a month sourdough day, we have to have something that we enjoy, that day or the next day, and that will be these chocolate chip cookie bars. But then I will go ahead and cut the rest into small squares, and we'll flash freeze them just like I did the pancakes on a sheet, and we'll put those in the freezer to have a ready to go treat to have throughout the month. After Jim finished making the bread dough, he's gonna go on to start making the sourdough deep dish pizza crusts. And friends, this recipe is so good. So we have tried many different pizza recipes, sourdough pizza recipes, but we are from Chicago, and there is nothing better than deep dish Chicago style pizza, the kind that has the tomato sauce on the top and the rest of the ingredients below. That is just the best type of pizza in our opinion. And so we have been making this type of pizza crust for years, and it is so good. I will link the recipe below, but he is gonna go ahead and make those dough balls essentially. So he makes the recipe ×4 to make 4 deep dish pizza crusts. And then after he makes the dough, he goes ahead and divides them into 4 individual crusts, which are just basically the balls of pizza crust dough. Covers it with a little olive oil, and then he puts them into a quart size Ziploc freezer bag, and then just goes ahead and freezes the dough for the crusts. And then a few days before we are going to have our pizza night, I pull one of those crusts out of the freezer and I put it in the fridge for maybe 3 or so days. And then the morning, first thing when I get up, on the day that we're gonna be eating that pizza, I pull it out of the fridge, I put it into a bowl, cover it with a towel, and let it rise on the counter for several hours. And we have been super, super pleased with how well the pizza crusts do freezing and then thawing and still rising to make a really, really good crust. So Jim will go ahead and roll it out. We like to make our deep dish pizza in a 12-inch cast iron pan, and then he rolls it out. We bake it for a few minutes, and then I go ahead and add the toppings. Our favorite way to do this is we do a layer of pesto at the bottom, and then we do a mixture of our shredded farmhouse cheddar cheese and our mozzarella cheese. Add sausage on top of that, and then the final layer is a layer of tomato sauce on top. And so everyone in our family loves it. We are kind of teetering on the edge of one of these pizzas being enough for our family. I feel like really we could move to making 2 pizzas for our family, but I've been resisting that for a long time because then we'd have to make like 8 pizza crusts at a go on our sourdough days, which feels a little intimidating. And so we are kind of trying to make 1 pizza crust work for the time being, but I see that transition happening in the near future for us. The last thing I am making here for this sourdough session is our English muffins. And so making the dough for your English muffins is actually gonna be really, really similar to making the dough that you would make for the bread. You're just gonna be adding your flour and water with your sourdough starter, turning it into a dough and just letting it sit and rise overnight. So that whole routine of making all of those different things will usually take us maybe around 2 hours to do in a given sourdough session. And then we're gonna have a few things that we need to kind of wrap up the next day. And so when we get up the next day, Jim has the bread that has been rising overnight that he is gonna go ahead and take that big bread dough and divide it into 2 separate portions, because we're gonna turn that into 2 different loaves of bread. And you can make whatever shape of bread that you like, but we always like to have sandwich bread on hand. And so we're gonna shape those loaves into a loaf pan to cook it that way. And after he gets the dough in the loaf pans, you're gonna let that sit and rise for a second rise for another 2 to 3 hours before going ahead and then baking it. When it comes to freezing bread, how we like to do that is after we have baked it, pulled it out of the oven, we let it cool completely. If you slice it while it's still hot, one, it's gonna be harder to slice, but if you try to freeze it while it's still warm at all, those bread slices are gonna stick together. But after it's fully cooled, we go ahead and slice it, and then we just place it into a gallon size freezer bag. One thing here is that you wanna make sure you don't like overpack that freezer bag. If the bread is really compressed together, then it's gonna be a lot harder to kind of pry those slices apart when you want to thaw them. But as long as there's kind of some wiggle room in that bag, it's really pretty simple to take out however many slices you need when you want to remove a few to thaw. And so we haven't had any problems just slicing the bread into slices and freezing it in gallon-sized Ziploc bags. And then the next morning, I'm going to go ahead and make English muffins. And so this has been a new favorite of ours more recently. We love how it's basically just kind of a different form of making bread. And so you're gonna take your dough in the morning. You'll probably need to add a little extra flour to it. You want to make English muffins that are gonna be a fairly stiff texture when you pull them apart, not kind of flop like a pancake. And so we found adding a little extra flour along with a little bit of maple syrup and salt and baking soda to help them rise. Mix that together, and then you're gonna pull apart just basically little blobs of dough. And so this is what's gonna be your English muffin. They don't need to be perfectly shaped or anything like that, but basically you wanna make sure they're just not flattening like a pancake when you pull them off. And you can see here I'm even having to like add some extra flour to the pieces that I've pulled off because they were kind of flattening on me. And so you wanna make sure they set up nicely. And after you've pulled apart those kind of dough, little blobs of dough, you're gonna put those on a hot, like piping hot cast iron pan with a little bit of oil on it. And you're gonna kind of almost just sear the bottom of those English muffins just for a couple of seconds. And then you're gonna turn your stovetop down to low. And so the trick with English muffins is wanting to get them fully cooked in the middle without burning the top or the bottom of the English muffins. And so what we have found, the easiest way to do that is to put them on your pan with the pan on high, but then really quickly after all those dough balls are on the pan, turn your stove down to low, flip them over to the other side, and then I like to cover the pan with a lid for a good 5 to 10 minutes, and that really is where the magic happens. And so cooking on low is just gonna create steam in the pan to cook the inside of those English muffins without burning your outside of the English muffins. And so that works really, really well for us. Just let them sit there on the pan for 5 to 10 minutes and then check them, see if they're ready to pull off the pan. But you're gonna have a nice kind of flaky interior with just kind of a slightly seared or browned top and bottom, and they're just really good. We've really enjoyed adding these to our repertoire. And also these are really easy to freeze. Just go ahead, kind of like your pancakes or the cookie bars, lay them out in a single layer on a baking sheet, stick them in the freezer, and then store them in a gallon size plastic bag in the freezer and pull them out as you want to use them. This simple once a month sourdough routine has really been just life-giving and game-changing for our family to enjoy all the benefits and just really fun things that sourdough adds to our life without it feeling like it's taking over or getting to be too much. And so it's just been a really fun addition to kind of our family's routine. So you certainly don't need to be a sourdough expert to get started with trying sourdough. We certainly aren't, but we have had a lot of fun incorporating it into kind of our monthly rhythms and routine, enjoying all of the deliciousness that it has offered our family. So thanks so much for watching today, and we'll see you next time.